Good morning. It's so weird to be able to do this with you guys, but I hope you are doing well. This is a lecture on D-Day, which I would much rather do in person and with all of you around me, but we'll get through it. So I'm going to start with a map and then show you some slides, and we'll tell you what D-Day is all about. Okay. So this is the map of Europe at the time, and it's 1944. And as you can see, all the red are the Axis powers. Originally, that was Germany, Italy, and Japan, but Germany was such a dominant force militarily that they pretty much took over all the other areas of red that you can see. Switzerland's that gray area in the middle. They're always neutral because no one can get tanks across the Alps. And you can see that the only areas that are blue are the UK over here, Great Britain it was called then, Russia, which is over in the top right, um, and it does have Egypt down below, but they weren't really fighting in Europe at that point. And then the other would have been the US. So Spain is over here. They were fascist as well, but they were sticking out of the war. All right, so let's go to the slides. Okay. D-Day is also called Operation Overlord. It happened on June 6th, 1944. And the whole objective of it was to open up a Western front to force the Axis powers to fight on both fronts. So this was primarily, it was an Allied joint venture, but it was really the US's first true foray into World War II. And Russia was on the eastern side. UK was on the western side, but it was an island, and so it couldn't get into like land any like military equipment on the western side, and they wanted to force Hitler to fight on both sides. So it's called D-Day because it was a secret operation, and it's a military term when they say instead of saying we're going to go on June 6, 1944, because obviously you're trying to keep it secret when you're going to invade someone. So they just will refer to it to all the soldiers that they're training, to almost everybody except for the total top brass. They're saying, we're going on D-Day, and D just stands for day. And they would say at H hour, at M minute, so that they don't have to actually give out any of those details ahead of time. All right, here are the three allies. On the left is Winston Churchill. In the middle, so he's from the UK, he's the British Prime Minister at the time. In the middle is FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, again, seated as always, because as we talked about before, he had polio, so he's always pictured seated. And to the right of him is Stalin, Joseph Stalin, who was the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, and himself a brutal dictator. But in this war, it was one of those things where the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so Stalin joined with UK and the US, and these were the three men who were kind of leading, at least the political leaders at the time. All right, so it was the largest sea land air invasion in history. I mean, it was gigantic. And it was such a major operation because they had to land on these beaches in Normandy, France. We'll look at a map in a second. It was a joint Allied operation. So there was the US and the UK, and France, which had been taken over, had some soldiers left that were in the UK, and they joined in, and Canada joined in. At the time, he was later to become a president of the US, but at this point, he's a general. General Eisenhower was the person put in command of all those forces from all those countries. They planned it for 2 years, and they had no fallback option. It had taken 2 years to create all the equipment, like just to create the types of boats that would land on a beach in Normandy, France, was really difficult because you had to ground them right up onto the beach, um, and they had put so much money and so much effort into this, and they really had no backup plan. If this hadn't worked, the war would have continued, and perhaps Hitler's, would have been successful for a much longer time. It also got the U.S. completely out of the depression by this point. I mean, the war had been going on for a while, but this was a massive industrial output from the U.S. And so they made the boats, they made the planes, they made the munitions, they did all of this, and so that got everybody working in this country. Because this had to be a secret operation, they also put a lot of effort into this thing that I kind of find hysterical. It was a disinformation campaign. It was called Operation Fortitude. At the time, they happened to know, because spies were all throughout this war. They knew that General Patton, who had been very successful in some of the battles, especially in like Northern Africa, was someone that Hitler really admired. And he assumed that any major operation, because Hitler knew they were going to try to do a major invasion, he assumed that Patton would be the one that would be guiding it. So Patton instead was put in northern Scotland, and he was given fake tanks, there we go, and aircraft. As you can see below, that tank is actually just an inflatable. Each of us could just lift it up and hold it over our heads. But from the air, it looks like a real tank. They had fake soldiers that the actual Patton would march in between, have like march up and down the lines, and it looked like he was training them and yelling at them, because the Nazis were doing a lot of aerial surveillance, and so this was all a campaign to make Hitler think that instead of going into France, which was their real destination, that they would be going into Norway. And so that's what this was all about, Operation Fortitude. And it really was quite successful, frankly. But here's where we actually landed. So you can see here's Great Britain. There are 5 ports that boats are leaving from, and they are traveling all night over into what's called Normandy, France. These beaches down here. Different groups had different beaches assigned to them. It was like a really detailed operation. So everybody knew what beach they had to land on and what their job was on that beach. But it was actually turned out to be a bit of a disaster. Here are the things that the Germans had done to try to prevent this. First of all, back to this for a second. The Germans had put obstacles down all this whole coastline. They were assuming, because UK is right here, Great Britain's right here, and France is right here, and the Channel's not very far, that this would be the point where they would most likely cross. Particularly right here, they thought this Calais point was really going to be the spot where the Allies landed. So, but even so, all up and down this coast, they had these obstacles that are actually quite tall. They're like 6 or 7 feet tall. And they are these metal things that make it impossible for a boat to land. So the other thing is Normandy has these, in sort of peacetime, has this beach line that's flat, but it goes straight up a cliff. So the job was to land the boats onto these beaches and then to blow up enough of this to and make it into a road all within like a few hours, to be able to get tanks offloaded off these boats and up onto these hills. It was going to be, no matter what, this was always going to be like a really risky, crazy operation. And just to make things worse, up on the top of these cliffs were these bunkers, these German bunkers that had machine gunners at the top, who were set to, they had sights on the beach, so that if anyone tried to land, they would be mowed down by machine guns. So France at this point had been occupied for a few years. I think they were occupied in 1939, and this is 44, so it had been 5 years under German occupation. And most of the French disliked the Germans, not surprisingly. But their a lot of them sort of just were scared and they lived under, the German occupation, much like what you saw in Poland. Even people who didn't like the Germans sort of went along with everything. But there was an active French resistance at the time, resistance movement, and they would have just little cells of people, so you wouldn't know who was in it. So, for example, if you joined the French resistance, you might know the other four people that you worked with, but you had no idea who else was in it. So that if any one person or people were caught, they could not blow the whole movement. Like, so you only knew exactly who was in your one group. And there was this one guy who was a painter, meaning like an interior painter, walls inside, who wanted to join, and everyone in that town thought like, oh God, we don't trust him. So they weren't going to go with it. They weren't going to take his help. But he ended up getting called by the Nazis, who had had an office in one of the towns there along the French coast, and they asked him to repaint their offices. So he came in, and all the German officers had to leave, and he just took his paint cans, emptied out the paint, and folded up any maps that he could see and put them in the empty paint cans and left. And then he brought them to what someone who we thought would be in the French resistance says, can you use these? And it turned out that they were really meticulous maps of all the defended points along the coast and were incredibly helpful to the planners of D-Day. There was also a cyclist, and Germans were really into athletes. They thought that was like especially white Aryan athletes because they were so hooked on racial superiority and white supremacy. So they really admired athletes, and this was a well-known cyclist at the time, and he would go for these like 50 to 100-mile bike rides along the German coast. He'd do these circuits, a couple times a week, a few times a week, and he would run into German soldiers. He'd always stop and chat with them, and they liked him, and he was really, what he was doing was gathering information constantly and saying, okay, it looks like that they've moved a new group of soldiers into here. It looks like at this particular bunker, they're using prisoners of war from Czechoslovakia who don't seem to be very solid with the Germans. So maybe that would be a good weak point. He was passing on every bit of information he could find, and it was vital. Then there was this code word called dice on the carpet. I don't know how they come up with these things, but it's not a random thing that people would be likely to say. And a lot of people were listening to British broadcasting in France to try to understand what was happening in the world beyond like the German propaganda. And they knew the resistance had been told, as soon as you hear dice on the carpet said on a BBC broadcast, a British broadcast, you know that the next day is D-Day, and go out and start sabotaging any communication lines, any transportation ways, motorways, bridges, railroad tracks, phone lines, telegraph wires, anything that you can, sabotage it so that the Germans won't be able to communicate with each other and let them know that the invasion is happening. So that's all done as a precursor to D-Day itself. They also did aerial bombardment, meaning they took planes and bombed the crap out of those areas. But they did that a lot. They didn't do it just the night before because then it would have been a dead giveaway. So there had been months of bombing along the French coast, and it's tricky because you don't want to necessarily kill French citizens. They're trying to get military targets. They're trying to get places where tanks are held, but it's not always perfect. The night before, a group called the 101st Airborne, they're a group of paratroopers, meaning those people who jump out of a plane and use a parachute to land. They're sent in the night before, right behind enemy lines, because they need to have people on kind of interior France a little bit, along the coast, but not right on the coast, so that when the American and Canadian and other allied forces land, there will be another force that can come in from behind. And they're also doing sabotage things like if they find a German tank, they put sand in the gas tank so that it grinds to a halt, or blow it up if they can, or blow up a bridge, things like that. When they prepared, they had to choose a special date. They looked for a date where it was a new moon, meaning not a lot of light, because if it was full moon, anyone could see them coming. And there were thousands of boats coming across the water from the UK, so they had to make sure it was a dark night. And they wanted to arrive at dawn, but they need the tide to be out because those obstacles are right at the sort of high line of the beach, high tide line. So they wanted the tide out so they could actually unload and then try to remove those obstacles. They were set to go June 5th, but it didn't work. And instead, they went on June 6th. It was poor weather on June 5th. And even on June 6th, it wasn't great. At this point, and I usually just have people watch a couple different videos, and I'm going to put those as links for you to watch if you like. For those of you who are a little squeamish about battles, the second clip, which is from Saving Private Ryan, it's like the first 20 minutes of it, is brutal. So you don't have to watch, but it does give you a sense of like what they are up against when all these soldiers try to land on this beach in France. The first one will be something from a PBS broadcast called Band of Brothers. It's about the 101st Airborne. And it's just, I would just have you watch the very beginning of this, of the first episode called Day of Days. That's about the paratroopers going across. And you don't have to watch the whole thing, but you can get a sense of like kind of what these men were up against and how they felt. All right. Finally, in the analysis of why did this win, because it actually was successful, which is amazing. There's a famous historian. He actually wrote the foreword to the book that you all read, War Stories, and he was from New Orleans, and there's an amazing museum about D-Day and World War II in New Orleans, and that's why all those stories from War Stories ended up in New Orleans, because that book was compiled there. But anyway, this famous historian, he credited our success or the Allied success to these reasons. For one, he thinks democratic countries had an advantage over authoritarian. And the reason he said that is that in democratic countries, there is a little bit less respect for just an overall authority. There's less fear. And so when things went wrong on D-Day, which a ton of things went wrong, if someone got killed who was critical to the success of it or didn't land in the right spot, someone else took over, and everyone felt like united, and we're doing this together, and we know what to do, and I don't have to wait for the chain of command to tell me what to do. Whereas with the Germans, on June 6th, on the day that the landing began, right early in the morning, the people who were, the gunners at that particular bunkers on those beaches, they tried to get word like the invasion's happening. It's happening right now. Here it goes. And they tried to get word to Hitler. And Hitler was, hundreds of miles away at that point, but they telegrammed him, and his aide, who was super scared of Hitler, didn't dare wake him because Hitler was grumpy if he got woken too early. So he let Hitler sleep in, and it was like a few hours before he finally woke up, and then he said, the invasion's on. If Hitler had known right from the beginning, he probably could have taken charge a little bit better, but he didn't know because he was sleeping and no one dared wake him because it was an authoritarian government and everyone was scared of Hitler. So, and no one dared to take charge with him sleeping. So everyone waited to hear from what does our German commander want from us. The other thing is that the German army, or the German Reich, was spread too thin. There just weren't enough loyal German soldiers to occupy practically all of Europe. So they used prisoners of war, like the Czechs and the Poles and other countries that they had invaded. And prisoners of war aren't going to necessarily be loyal. So as soon as they saw, if they were some of the gunners or some of the people who were supposed to be defending the French coast, they're like, forget it. Why would I bother trying to defend the Germans? I hate the Germans. So that was a problem for them. The resistance, though it had a lot of flaws, ended up being a powerful force as well. And finally, the last bit of analysis is that Hitler was had a lot of hubris, which means total arrogance, and he just couldn't imagine that he could be wrong, and which meant he was good at offense and terrible at defense. So once all those soldiers and all those planes and boats and tanks and other military equipment got unloaded onto the French coast, and started pushing in toward, taking back France, originally going up to Belgium, taking Belgium, and eventually just pushing the German army back, whereas the Soviet Union was doing it the same on the eastern side. Hitler kind of fell apart. He wasn't able to really to defend as well as he'd been able to be on offense, because he could never imagine that he was ever have to defend. He always thought he would win. So, for all those reasons, it was remarkably a successful campaign and very lucky. I'll put the links down on on Google Classroom, and I'll put a little assignment to go with it. All right, bye.